Rain hammers down on a small chapel roof as thunder rolls across the Tennessee hills. It's just after midnight when a flicker of motion appears in the surveillance footage, grainy, black and white. A figure in a long coat steps onto the porch of Hope Chapel Baptist, sets something down beside the door, rings the bell, and vanishes into the storm. Inside the bundle is a newborn boy, wrapped in a hospital blanket, his umbilical cord still attached. No note, no name, just silence. The town of Hollow Pines, Tennessee, wasn't on most maps. Just 4,000 people, 2 traffic lights, and the kind of secrets that stayed buried under picket fences and Sunday sermons. It was the kind of town where everyone claimed to know everyone, but no one really knew anyone at all. Hope Chapel Baptist sat at the top of Briar Hill, overlooking rows of clapboard houses and rusted trucks. Pastor Elijah Mercer had just celebrated 25 years at the pulpit. He was the first to find the baby that rainy morning in October 1993. He named the infant Thomas, after the apostle who doubted until he saw the truth. Thomas was estimated to be just under 48 hours old. No birth record. No one came forward to claim him. Authorities canvassed every hospital in the Tri-County area. No matching births. The closest clue? A nurse at Franklin General remembered a young woman who came in alone, in labor, refused to give her name, and discharged herself against medical advice shortly after giving birth, vanishing before paperwork could be filed. By the time the Department of Children's Services opened a case, Thomas had already become something of a local legend, the church steps baby. He was placed with a local foster couple, John and Dana Kessler, who later adopted him. And for the next 3 decades, the truth about his origins would stay buried, or so everyone thought. Thomas grew up in Hollow Pines. Kind, quiet, deeply observant. By his teen years, he was asking questions. Why didn't they want me? Who would leave a baby like that? He wasn't bitter, just haunted by a void he couldn't fill. In high school, he kept mostly to himself. Played guitar, worked part-time at the local feed store, volunteered at the same church that once saved his life. Then, at a youth service, he met Eliza Morgan. Bright, charismatic. She wore combat boots to choir practice and asked impossible questions during Bible study. Thomas was a slow burn. Eliza was fire on gasoline. They started dating at 18. By 25, they were engaged. But when he was invited to meet her family, the past started to unravel. Eliza's parents, Dr. Peter Morgan and Rebecca Morgan, were respected. Her father was the town's only surgeon. Her mother ran the women's shelter and taught Sunday school. Their house on Willow Lane had wraparound porches, white columns, and family portraits lining the staircase. At dinner, Thomas felt something strange. Rebecca couldn't look him in the eye. Peter seemed to study him like a specimen. Days after the visit, Eliza confessed. "I don't know what's going on, Thomas. My mom, she said something weird. She asked me if you'd ever had genetic testing." Like she was panicking. Disturbed, Thomas ordered a DNA testing kit. He had nothing to lose, just questions. When the results came back, they were more than surprising. He shared 49.8% DNA with Rebecca Morgan. At first, he assumed it was a glitch, but a second test confirmed it. Rebecca Morgan was his biological mother, and Peter Morgan, Eliza's father, was not the biological father, which meant Eliza wasn't his sister. But her mother had abandoned him, and now, decades later, he was about to marry into the same family that left him on a church porch. Thomas met with Rebecca Morgan alone. The conversation was cold, cautious, devastating. She admitted to giving birth at 18 before her marriage. The child's father was a married professor from the nearby university. Ashamed, panicked, under pressure from her strict Baptist parents, she delivered the baby in secret and left him where she thought he'd be found, at the foot of a church. She never told Peter. He believed Eliza was their first and only child. She begged Thomas not to tell anyone, claimed she'd spent years trying to forget what she did, that she only wanted to preserve her family's peace. But Thomas couldn't let it go, not after decades of lies. And then he discovered something darker. Thomas filed a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, request for his original DCS file. What he got back was heavily redacted, but one social worker note stood out. Child likely born in hospital. Nurse at Franklin Gyn claims father present pressured mother to leave AMA. This contradicted everything Rebecca said. Digging deeper, Thomas interviewed that same nurse, now retired, who confirmed the memory. She was terrified, but the man with her, he wasn't a professor. He was a doctor. I'd seen him before. He worked at Franklin Gyn. A week later, Thomas found an old staff photo. And there, standing in the back row, Dr. Peter Morgan, his adoptive father-in-law. After the DNA test, Thomas had tried to believe Rebecca's story. A scared, pregnant teen. A shame-soaked decision. A ghost she tried to bury. But the nurse's recollection told a different story. Rebecca hadn't been alone. And the man with her hadn't just been a professor. He was a doctor. A man in a white coat. A man Thomas had shaken hands with and called Sir. Dr. Peter Morgan. Rebecca had lied about the baby's conception, but maybe the lie ran deeper. What if she hadn't acted alone? What if Peter had known all along? Worse, what if he had orchestrated it? Thomas couldn't confront them together. Not yet. So he turned to the one place the Morgans didn't control, the archives. Franklin General had moved locations in the early 2000s, but the county archive still held physical records, employment logs, union newsletters, even internal memos. There, buried in a stack of quarterly bulletins, was an entry. March 1993. Dr. Peter Morgan joins OB-GYN unit. Recently relocated from Charleston. Interim coverage requested due to case overload. The month matched Thomas's estimated birth date. Then came a memo dated October 15th, 1993, one day after Thomas was found on the church steps. Security concern reported by nursing staff. Unauthorized birth procedure recorded as miscarriage. No patient discharge file available. Dr. Morgan signed off. HR review pending. Thomas read it 3 times. Dr. Morgan had falsified paperwork, and someone had tried to stop him. Thomas requested the incident report mentioned in the memo, but it was gone, either removed or misfiled. A familiar pattern for those who've looked into small-town cover-ups. But what Thomas did find was a name. Margaret Maggie Ayers, the nurse who filed the concern. A quick search revealed she now lived outside Chattanooga. Retired, unlisted number, but still living. He made the drive alone, not telling Eliza, not telling his parents, not even sure what he'd say. When Maggie opened the door, a gray-haired woman with tired eyes, she stared at Thomas for a long time. And then she said, "You look just like her, and just like him." Over coffee at her kitchen table, Maggie told him everything. In 1993, Rebecca Morgan came into Franklin General in labor. She wasn't alone. She arrived with Dr. Morgan. Not yet her husband, but already her mentor and, as Maggie put it, something more behind closed doors. Rebecca was frantic, scared. Peter was calm, too calm. Maggie delivered the baby. Healthy, full term. Boy, she wanted to hold him. She cried, said she couldn't go through with it. And that's when Peter stepped in. According to Maggie, Peter took the baby and told Rebecca she had no choice. He told Maggie to record it as a miscarriage and write up a false chart. Maggie refused. I told him I wasn't going to lie. He threatened my job, said he'd report me for incompetence, that he'd destroy me. She filed a report. It disappeared. 3 months later, she was reassigned and later let go under questionable circumstances. She never saw the baby again. Until now, 2 years after the incident, Peter and Rebecca married. He adopted Eliza, Rebecca's firstborn, who had been born just a year later. But now Thomas knew Eliza was not Rebecca's first child. He was, which made the lie even bigger, the crime even colder. Peter had erased him professionally, legally, emotionally. He hadn't just helped cover the abandonment. He'd engineered it. And Thomas had grown up in the same town, under the same man's watchful eye, never knowing. Thomas returned to Hollow Pines with a copy of the 1993 memo and Maggie's signed statement. He confronted Rebecca first. She broke down. "I loved you. I never wanted that." He said it was the only way we'd survive, that no one could ever find out. She claimed Peter promised her a clean slate, said the baby, Thomas, would be adopted into a better life, that if she ever spoke of him again, she'd lose everything. Her marriage, her daughter, her standing in the community. But the emotion didn't move Thomas. You let him erase me, and you lived like I never existed. Thomas went to the police with the files. But it wasn't clear what laws had been broken. The statute of limitations for falsified records had expired, and the abandonment case had long since gone cold. Still, the court granted him access to sealed juvenile files, and what he found stunned even seasoned investigators. There was a blank spot in his adoption record, an entire page missing, one that was supposed to list the hospital of birth. When pressure was put on Franklin General's legal department, a tech recovered a backup of the original file. And there, in scanned ink, infant delivered by Dr. Peter Morgan. Mother, Rebecca L. Thompson. Her maiden name. Case closed. The truth, buried under 3 decades of silence, was now in writing. The Morgans didn't face jail time, but their lives unraveled. Peter was forced into early retirement from the hospital. A state ethics board investigated his past cases. Several lawsuits followed. Rebecca withdrew from public life. Eliza, caught in the emotional crossfire, broke off the engagement. Not because of genetics, they weren't biologically related, but because of the betrayal, the weight of lies. I don't know who my parents are anymore, she said in a statement to local media, and I don't know who I am because of them. Thomas moved away from Hollow Pines shortly after. In the spring of 2024, Thomas Kessler packed up what remained of his life in Hollow Pines and left. He didn't tell many people, didn't hold a goodbye party. There was no closure to be had in a town that had tried, consciously or not, to erase him. He moved to Asheville, North Carolina, hoping to disappear, at least for a while. He rented a small apartment above a bookstore, started therapy, adopted a dog, but the story wouldn't let him go. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders. In the mirror, the face of Peter Morgan, in the bone structure and eyes. In the news, headlines about other abandoned children, birth record tampering, and hospitals that quietly lost babies in the system. And in his inbox, messages, dozens, and hundreds of people like him. Within weeks of the story going public, first in the Hollow Pines Herald, then picked up by Regional Dispatch, Thomas's case went viral. A baby left on church steps, unknowingly raised in the same town as his biological parents, nearly marrying into his own bloodline. It was the kind of story the internet devoured. But something else happened too. Emails, messages, handwritten letters, from women who were forced to give up their babies under threat. From adults who discovered, as teens, that the people raising them weren't their real parents. From nurses, social workers, and hospital techs who'd seen irregularities they were told not to question. And from a woman in Missouri who claimed her son's birth certificate had been altered deliberately by a small-town doctor. Same year, same hospital system, Franklin General. Thomas filed a formal petition to access archived internal documents from Franklin General and its partner hospitals. Initially, they denied the request, so he went public. He created a blog, The Son Who Survived. He wrote about Maggie, about the nurse who lost her job, about the silence, about the memo with his name blacked out. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for change. And that's when a former billing clerk came forward. Her name was Linda Ross. Retired in 2019, she'd quietly saved photocopies of several billing sheets and transfer logs she believed were being altered or destroyed. One file, dated October 13th, 1993, showed a patient labeled Thompson, RL, being admitted under a false ID and discharged 14 hours later by Dr. P. Morgan. Linda's records included a payment discrepancy. One procedure had been coded for miscarriage counseling, while a second showed a live birth, but the file was removed from hospital billing before it was submitted to insurance. They didn't just abandon you, Linda said over the phone. They tried to erase the fact that you were ever born. With legal help from a civil rights group specializing in adoption fraud and medical ethics, Thomas took his case to the Tennessee General Assembly. He proposed what would become known as the Safe Identity Act. The law aimed to enforce permanent, verifiable hospital birth records, criminalize the falsification of birth events by licensed medical professionals, require mandatory reporting of any anonymous birth to state child welfare departments, reopen sealed cases when DNA evidence proves misfiling or abandonment. It was met with resistance. Lawmakers called it too niche, too personal, a vendetta. But then national media picked up his story again. CNN, NPR, a Netflix docuseries option, and public pressure worked. In January 2025, the Safe Identity Act passed through committee. By March, it passed in the House. Thomas stood on the Capitol steps, no longer anonymous, no longer invisible. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a suburb outside Knoxville. Inside was a single handwritten page. I don't expect forgiveness. I know what we did. What I did was selfish. But when I look at what you become, I feel two things, shame and awe. I gave you away. You gave yourself a future. You gave others a voice. That is the opposite of what I deserved. R. Thomas folded the letter and placed it in a shoebox. He didn't know if he'd ever respond. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. But one Sunday morning in May, Eliza showed up at his door in Asheville. No warning, just tears in her eyes and a coffee in her hand. The way she always greeted him when things were still simple. "I don't know who my parents are anymore," she said, "but I know who you are." They sat on the porch in silence for an hour. She didn't ask him to come back. He didn't ask her to stay. But sometimes silence is its own kind of healing. Since Thomas went public, for hospitals across the Southeast have opened internal investigations into abandoned or misfiled births from the 1980s and 1990s. 2 nurses were reinstated after being fired decades ago for breach of confidentiality related to unreported births. A class action lawsuit was filed in late 2025 by 5 adults who discovered their birth records had been falsified, citing Thomas's case as precedent. And Franklin General? They issued an apology, not to Thomas directly, but to the families impacted by past errors in protocol. It wasn't justice, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes in true crime, that's the closest we get. Thomas walks the old church steps again, this time in spring. The paint has been redone. The air smells of lilac and soil. He runs his hand along the railing, the same one his newborn self was left beside. "They expected me to vanish," he says, voice quiet. "But I didn't. I lived, and I learned, and now I'm seen." Thomas Kessler currently works as an advocate for adoptee rights and ethical birth record keeping. His story is being adapted into a limited docuseries called The Baby on the Steps. The Safe Identity Act has since inspired similar bills in New York, Illinois, and California. The boy they tried to erase became the man who made sure it never happened again. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you think, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. There's a new one coming soon, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.